Hello everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Coffee Shop Philosophy. As always, I'm Killian Hobbs, Journalism Director at think-liberty.com, and your host for the evening, or morning, depending on when you're listening to this. You can follow us on pretty much every form of social media. You can listen to our podcasts wherever you listen to podcasts. There's also a video series that we host that you can follow on YouTube and find us there. And you can always hit the little subscribe bell on our website to get daily updates on all the new articles on philosophy, economics, general opinions, and news. I think that just about covers it for plugs and the like. So I'm going to jump right into the topic today. This will be the last episode on the little series of them that I've done so far. If you haven't noticed from the previous episodes, I've been covering things related to the human condition for the most part, the way we communicate with each other, the way that we experience reality, experience the development of our own cultures and the way that technology has affected them, so on and so forth. Today's episode, though, I'm going to touch on something that's probably the most important aspect of human existence, and that is happiness. Very basic concept, something all of us have felt in some way, shape, or form at some point in our lives, but it's one of those topics that there's a lot of writing about, a lot of science behind, yet we don't really spend a whole lot of time reading up on the concepts of happiness. Sure enough, you might have picked up a self-help book somewhere along the lines of 10 steps to, feel good about yourself. Today, though, I'm going to be getting into the particulars. So, to start off, what do we mean by happiness? Now, one of my favorite comedians, even though he's stolen jokes as was found later on in his career, and that kind of soured him for me a little bit. One of my favorite comedians before was a guy by the name of Dennis Leary. Dennis Leary had a comedy routine that he called No Cure for Cancer. It was one of his specials back in the 90s. You may have heard the song Asshole that everyone played every once in a while. Used to be a pretty big song, but that's neither here nor there. He had a joke in this comedy routine where he's talking about happiness, and he's talking about all the happy people running around and feeling great about themselves and patting themselves on the back and doing this, that, and the next thing. But the joke goes where happiness, it's not an eternal thing or anything like that. In his mind, happiness was a cigarette. Happiness was a chocolate bar. Happiness was a 5-second orgasm. You come, you smoke the bud, you eat the bar, you go to bed, you get up the next day and go right back to fucking work. That is the idea of it. That is what happiness is in his eyes. Now, I have to disagree. Now, obviously, you made this as a comedy thing. It was supposed to be a big ha-ha, but there's a lot of truth in comedy. It's the truth aspect hiding behind a lot of these jokes that really makes comedy punch the way that it does. The idea of happiness on its own seems very ethereal. It's like anything else where it's a social construct based on subjective experience. The thing that makes one person happy is not necessarily going to make another person happy. But we all experience happiness. We all know what it feels like. So when we're trying to define happiness, the first thing we need to do is separate it from joy. Now, joy and happiness usually go hand in hand as far as most people use these terms, but there's a very clear difference between the two of them. Joy is a very temporary thing. Joy is something happens, it brings you joy. It's a very material thing. It's a very instantaneous thing. It's an event or something that takes place that brings you a sense of happiness. That's why we call it, a joy instead of just calling it happiness. Happiness, though, that one will take more time to cultivate and will last longer. So you won't be happy in the true sense of happiness just from, getting a promotion at your job. That's it's a great thing, of course, but it's a temporary feeling. It's that momentary elation. It's that joyous feeling that you get from that. But we're trying to get into happiness. So when it comes to this notion of lasting happiness, we already know that that's just not a thing. You're never going to feel one emotion, no matter what the emotion is. You're never going to feel one emotion at all times. That's just not a thing. However, there are ways to cultivate the way that you feel happy, the things that bring you happiness and being able to keep that more consistent. So back to the point of the episode, I'm going to be focusing on where these sources of happiness come from, as well as some of the writings and philosophical work that have gone into the study of human happiness. So what better place to start with the study of happiness than centuries ago in Southeast Asia when the topic of suffering was key? What I'm referring to here is Buddhism. Now, in the Buddhist, they call it a faith, and I've never really been a big fan of the faith concept with it. If you actually read the Sutras of Buddhism, he wasn't really all that towards spiritualism in the actual deific sense, but more so just a matter of understanding one's self. And it's that understanding of oneself that becomes a big part of the Eightfold Path that Buddhism teaches. So, Siddhartha Gautama, which is the name of the prince who became the Buddha, which actually translates to mean teacher, he came up with the notion of the Eightfold Path as a way to enlighten oneself, which wasn't necessarily the same thing as being happy, but being happy was a byproduct of being enlightened. So in the realm of Buddhism, the concept was that you would follow the Eightfold Path, you would meditate on things, you would rid yourself of these temporary joys that were only falsehoods in the true sense of what you were aiming for, which was deep personal happiness and contentment and understanding, as well as compassion towards other people. And it leads you to focus in on the things that will bring you that. On a previous episode, I talked about Buddhists being involved in neuroplasticity and studies that took place with that, where they found that people meditating on compassion towards others actually changed the way that the brain acted and reacted to these meditations, both in a resting state, if you will, of just how the brain naturally was, and during an active state when they were meditating on the concepts of compassion. Now, they don't meditate just on compassion. They meditate on other things as well, such as ridding themselves of their own suffering, becoming more in tune with the teachings of the Buddha, and also reaching happiness, being happy. Now, part of the meditative teachings that they use involves the reincarnation cycle, things like that. You don't need to use any of that sort of stuff. But it brings to a very basic point that you don't need to follow any religion or any teachings to really start practicing yourself, which is meditate on what actually makes you happy. Think of the things in your life that actually make you happy. And I'm not, again, talking about the temporary things. I'm not talking about materialistic things, because those things are temporary and the risk of their loss can bring you suffering. In the Buddhist sense, obviously, if you lose $100 out of your pocket, yeah, that's going to suck and you're going to feel upset about it, but you're not going to suffer in the truest sense. But in this case, suffering is the unpleasant feelings. It's the negative feelings. So with these meditation idea, you don't have to sit cross-legged going om in order to do it, but being happy long-term is a conscious effort. It's something where you need to think about what makes you happy or what is going to make you happy. Now, again, I've gone into most of this stuff already, but I cannot reiterate it enough. It's really important to separate the concepts of joy and happiness from one another. Joy is the temporary things that can bring you happiness. But again, the key word there is temporary. If you're trying to be more consistently happy, then the way that you do that is by finding the things that will make you happy long term that are not materially based. There's other parts of the teachings that are really useful. Even if you never subscribe to it, I still suggest reading into it, just as I suggest reading into any other faith, just for the sake of understanding the people of the world that you're going to be talking to. But it's really interesting, this notion of simply focusing on what it is and reasoning your way through it. Let your mind wander. Let your mind work through these things itself. The brain is an incredibly powerful tool. And you'd be surprised how much you can work out on your own if you simply allow yourself the time to try. Now, this is the ancient approach to happiness. This is the views in happiness from, again, centuries and centuries and centuries ago. But obviously, happiness is a very important thing for the human species. So, there's been far more studies recently, or concepts recently, that go into the topic of happiness. And I'm going to cover that in a little bit, because there's been quite a few people throughout history that have focused their works on happiness. Now, one thing that's good to look at first is different theories of happiness. So, for example, if you go back to ancient Greece, there was one concept of happiness, which was hedonism. The idea that constantly indulging in these temporary material joys over and over again is what's going to bring you the closest thing to happiness, because an eternal emotion is impossible. So doing everything that makes you feel good, that is the most ethically right thing to do, and it's what's going to bring the most happiness, and this most important form of happiness. You fast forward, well, call it about 2 millennia or so, give or take, and you have John Stuart Mills with the concept of utilitarianism, where the most ethical right thing to do is to bring the most happiness and to do the most good for the most amount of people. Thus, the net happiness of everyone around is higher. There's also works from Thomas Aquinas, Vladislav Tatarkiewicz, and Sonia Lubomirsky. I apologize if I butchered those last 2 names. I tried practicing it about 20 times before I started recording this. If I got it wrong, I'm not going back, nor am I apologizing for it. So, these are the other people that have started to study into the psychology of happiness, into the causes of happiness, into the notions of personal virtues, the things that make you feel good about yourself or bring you happiness. Almost consistently across the board, being happy with one's self is the most consistent source of actual happiness. So, you might be able to provide for someone else or be able to help someone else, and that might bring you joy, or that might bring you happiness, but you're happy because you're happy with yourself for being able to do that, or having accomplished that. You're happy because you have this role that you've given yourself that you deem exceedingly important. You know, you're really happy to be a parent. You're really happy to be a respected member in the team that you have at work because of what you do and the levels that you've reached. Perhaps you're on the older side and you're really happy reflecting back on the life that you've had and being able to see the total list of things you've accomplished, and that brings you contentment with how you lived your life. All of these things can be sources of actual happiness. On top of being able to meditate on the topic and retrain your brain to be happier than you currently are, again through the neuroplasticity concept that I talked about in previous episodes, you can find your own path to being happier than you are today. And again, I'm trying to avoid the self-help approach to this. These are just different proven methods from very lengthy psychological and philosophical research done into the topic of human happiness. Most consistently throughout all of the different writings you'll find on these things comes down to the contentment of self and an alignment of your own ideals. If you are in line with what you stand for, with what you believe, and you are happy with what you are, then being happy with other things in life just becomes easier. One of the most interesting things I find with this is that people who are generally more upset or more downtrodden about life in general, and I'm not talking about people who actually suffer from depression, because there's a lot of reasons for it, either traumatic or chemical imbalance or different things like that. You know, my heart goes out to people with actual depression, and I'm not trying to say anything against them with this, but there are some people who are quote unquote depressed. They don't actually suffer from depression, but they just have a poor outlook on life. And again, I need to stress that there's a difference here. There is a huge difference between simply having a negative outlook on life versus actually suffering mental illness. This is directed at the former category, not the latter category. For people who are simply downtrodden about life, they're world weary, they look at things a little more cynically, you might be content with being the kind of person that does that, but is it actually making you happy to be that way? Because if the answer is no, the power lies with you to be able to change the way that you're feeling about that. I'll use an example here of things that you can do, a real life example. One of a friend of mine, and one of the listeners on the show, who actually did bother to follow up with the challenge that I laid down in the first episode of picking something new each month to try something different. She took the approach of trying to complain less. That was the challenge that she gave herself, because she found that she was being too negative too often about certain things and starting to get into, downward spirals about complain about one thing, complain about another. It goes on in an eternal cycle, especially when you're surrounded with people who also like to complain and want to complain. And that can just shift your entire day towards negativity. So she took on the idea of complaining less and trying to put positive spins on things. And that's a very difficult thing to do. But it's also a great way of trying to correct negativity in your life. And the more you reduce negativity, the more you can experience the positive, the more that you will experience happiness from that. Now, one that's really interesting when it comes to happiness is the fact that there's an entire school of economics related to happiness. So there's actually a thing called happiness economics. So in this case, it's a way of tracking the effects on human life inside of a country or inside of a region related to their well-being, the quality of life, their life satisfaction. It combines health, sociology, psychology, and actual economic measures in order to figure out how generally happy a populace is and how to affect change to improve the happiness even further. So you'll find, for example, in Western countries, a lot of countries are in the West generally happier than countries from, say, the Middle East, or countries from North Africa, or countries where there's a lot of poverty and hunger and strife that they have to experience day by day that can definitely lower their overall happiness. But it also flips back to the West, because the West ends up having higher drug addiction rates. The West ends up having higher suicide rates in certain cases, depending on how they measure everything out. The West ends up having more diagnosed people with forms of depression or other forms of, negative mental health. There's also the concept of poverty and the poverty line, because other countries work from a different poverty line than Western countries do, because overall we have higher standards of living. So what we consider poor, another country might consider well off or middle class, or even completely loaded as far as wealth is concerned, once currency exchange rates and everything else like that's taken into consideration. So all of these different metrics come into play when they're actually doing the economics of how happy a country is, or how happy a group of people can be within a country. So some of the things that they measure it on, it's good to have an idea, at least on this one, because I find the science behind this fascinating, or at least the social science for that matter. But they'll track it off of things like the GDP, the GNP, individual income averages, employment averages, how much freedom a person has over their own lives and their own happiness inside the country, social security measures, relationships, religious diversity, leisure options. All of these things come together to create a picture of how happy a country can be based on its socioeconomic structure. Now, while this concept is important and something that quite a few countries do take seriously, For me, I find there's a slight issue with trying to measure the economics of happiness. Now, as most people who follow libertarianism can tell you, yes, people having more of their own money, more control over their lives, and more freedom tends to make people happier. Basing happiness on general standards of life or basing it on materialistic things tends to disagree with most of the other studies that go into happiness. So, taking it back a step, Buddhism believed in removing the materialistic sides of your life so that you could focus on happiness in and of itself. Thomas Aquinas, for example, took the faith approach, and there was a lot of others that wrote on the concept of happiness through faith. You had people coming up with ethical concepts such as hedonism, utilitarianism, and having those as frameworks for being happy. And then there's, I find, the more important one, because happiness, again, is an emotion. It's part of your brain. It's part of your limbic system. It's something that comes from within. It's not a external thing. It's an internal thing. So I find that while you can glean a lot about human happiness from the way that we measure the things that make us happy, the most important source of information on human happiness is actually in the fields of psychology. So under psychology, when we're talking about happiness, there's a lot of different takes and approaches on it. You can find one, for example, would be something most of us are probably familiar with, which is Maslow's hierarchy of needs. It's a pyramid concept where you have a series of needs that are tiered differently, and you're happier the more of these tiers are fulfilled. But your happiness is going to be tied very heavily to fulfilling them in order. So if you have, a top end point such as being able to have fulfilling and meaningful relations with people, but you can't find a place to sleep or food to eat, then those meaningful relationships aren't going to really mean as much towards your overall happiness, because lower points on the hierarchy of needs are not being fulfilled. Another example is positive psychology, which again ties into a lot of the older thinkings on human happiness, which is visualizing it, maintaining positivity, removing negativity from your life, purposely trying to structure things so that you can feel happier more consistently, and making a conscious mental effort to be happier and more positive than you would be normally when you're first looking into being happier than you are. Because you're obviously not feeling happy if you start looking for ways to be happier than you are. If you were completely happy and content with everything that was going on in life, then chances are you wouldn't be looking for ways to be happy or trying to do things such as positively reorganize the way that you think and the way that you act in life to be happier. You wouldn't be looking at any of these things or paying attention to any of these things if you considered yourself a consistently happy person already. So, like I've covered the positive psychology and the Maslow's hierarchy of needs. There's also the one that I find ties very interestingly into libertarianism, which is the self-determination theory. Self-determination theory, it's what's known as a macro theory. It covers the concept of some of our innate needs, such as the Maslow concept, but it also covers things such as our inherent growth tendencies, as well as our sources of motivation. So, happiness in and of itself is a great motivation. If you think something's going to make you happy, then you're going to try to pursue that because people enjoy being happy. They like being happy. They consider happiness a thing to constantly strive for, and understandably so. But the theory itself is primarily connected to the motivation aspect and trying to work the psychology of people around being more self-motivated, more self-determined. So less the external stuff and more the internal. So like I mentioned earlier with the expressions of joy, more internal, non-materialistic, ethereal things that are coming from within you that are going to make you happier overall especially when compared to the momentary joys you might get from the small things in the world, such as the cigarette, the chocolate bar, and the 5-second orgasm. Now, going through all of this, we've talked a lot about sources of happiness, how to pursue it, what happiness is in comparison to other things, but we haven't really talked about what happiness is in and of itself, because it's next to impossible to put happiness into words. Everyone knows what happiness is. Everyone understands what happiness feels like, but because it's such an internal thing that's specific to each and every person, the way that they experience being happy, we can communicate the concept of it, but it's very difficult for us to truly express how we feel when we are feeling happy, other than simply throwing the word happy at it. For example, it reminds me of the old question of describe the color red. You can do a whole bunch of things and talk about, it's passion, it's this, it's that, trying to avoid just describing things that are colored red. But that's not going to tell anybody what red looks like, because though we all can communicate and understand that red is red, we don't have a way of expressing our internal understanding of this term, especially this issue that we have as a species for communication limitations definitely applies to emotive states. We can express that we're happy. We can talk about being happy. We can say that, we're really enjoying ourselves. Like, this is a great time. I'm happy. And we're jumping up and down and all that other stuff. But to actually express the way it internally feels is next to impossible, which in and of itself makes happiness an internal thing. You'd think that just by the way that we experience happiness, that we would come to understand that happiness is it's an internal state of being that we can't get from an outside source. We can't generate a pure internal feeling solely from external stimuli. It's just not the way that we're programmed. We're designed to be very extroverted as far as our social interactions are concerned and as far as the way we connect and adapt to the world. But as far as our understandings of ourselves and the way that we self-regulate, which would include regulating ourselves to be happy more often and for longer periods of time, that's entirely introverted. It's entirely internal. So I would say that one of the most important things, and I've said a lot of things are important with this because it's all a total package. As much information as you can take in your life that's going to lead to you being happier more often for longer periods of time throughout your life, I consider to be something that's very important. But the last thing that I'll say on this topic is that no matter how much you read into these concepts of happiness or ways that you can be happy or methodologies that you can use to train yourself to be happier, none of it is going to be foolproof. That's the one thing that no person who studies happiness, no person who writes the little help books about it, no theologian who's come up with their pathway through their faith about being happy, none of them are willing to acknowledge the fact that their methods aren't going to work for everyone. So it's on you, if you're truly pursuing happiness in a general sense, it's on you to sit down, work through what's going to make you happy, and being willing to say, this thing is bringing me joy, but I shouldn't focus on it because it's not going to actually make me happy. So one thing that would make me happy is, again, if you go to our website, you click the little bell to subscribe. If you go to any of our social media feeds and give us a like or a follow or anything, like whatever the terminology is for the social media platform you're on. Do that for us. Obviously keep in touch, follow up with the podcasts as we go along here. I hope you liked that sly little transition into my closing plugs here. I thought that was pretty good. And that, knowing that I can do that, that makes me happy. Now, if you liked what you heard and you've enjoyed this series, by all means, I'll see you again next week.